Rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita. необозримый к окраине, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, где такой родился человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, где такой родился человек. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Greetings everybody and welcome along to this, the latest episode in our ongoing series covering the work of Stalin from the collected edition of his works entitled On the Opposition. There you can see that's the volume, the rather large volume I'm taking these readings from. And that is the principal source we'll be using for today's episode, which is on Stalin's report on the 14th Congress of the Russian Communist Party brackets Bolsheviks. And this is a report that he wrote up for Pravda, covering the 6 main areas of discussion at the 14th Congress, and of course with specific reference to the views of the opposition, specifically in this case Trotsky. So that'll be what we're going to be doing this week. Next week we're going to be looking at the actual reply by Stalin to the criticisms made by the opposition in the 14th Congress. So this week we're doing Stalin's report on the 14th Congress. Next week we're doing Stalin's lengthy reply to the critics in the form of not just Trotsky, but Zinoviev and Kamenev and others at the 14th Congress. So today we're going to be looking at the outcomes, and I think there's a lot in here that is vital for our understanding of the debates within the Soviet Party in the 1920s, but also reveal to us why Stalin was the true inheritor of Lenin's leadership. In terms of Stalin was probably one of the very few at the highest level of the party who was able to combine different aspects of theory and practice together in a way that was reminiscent of Lenin. Others who had been in the revolutionary movement just as long were unable to do that. And some of those fell into the camp of the opposition. Some of those fell into ultra-leftist positions. Some of those fell into rightist positions. Trotsky covered both at various different points in his career. Bukharin started off as an ultra-left and ended up as an ultra-right. And so we'll be covering a little bit of that today and then taking some questions afterwards. So this is Stalin's report on the work of the 14th Congress. Now, Stalin talks about here how there's 6 main areas of debate at the 14th Congress, which is in turn the international situation, the tasks of the communists in the West, the tasks of the communists in the oppressed and colonized nations, the building of socialism in the USSR, party policy, i.e. Communist Party policy in the Soviet Union, and particularly in the countryside, and a report on the metal industry and its capacities and the building of it in the USSR. So those are the main areas which Stalin is going to be talking about. And so we're going to go through each of those in turn. So first point he comes to is, of course, on the international situation. Now, in the international situation, he does make the point, which is, of course, entirely correct, that there has been, is in 1925, he's saying this, a certain stabilization of capitalism in the imperialist countries, and that this has to be recognized and this has to be dealt with. And he makes the point that in the history of the development of the revolution in the Soviet Union, there was various points where the ruling class were able to stabilize the situation and the revolutionary movement went into a retreat. And that each stage of those, there were liquidators, as he calls them, screaming that the revolution was over, that the system had stabilized itself, that there was no chance of going forward now, and we should either give up or go into alliance with the liberals, or the Bolsheviks shouldn't exist anymore. And he's correct, which is that at each stage after 1905, there were new waves of liquidators and opportunists who popped up at every twist and turn, screaming that the time was not right, that there was never going to be a revolution, that the workers were hopelessly bound into the system, that things were too divided, etc., etc., etc. So every stage in the development of Bolshevism, Lenin and the other leaders had to, principally led by Lenin, had to wage a struggle against liquidationism and opportunism and pessimism, and also wild ultra-leftism. So these tendencies recur over and over again in every single historical period, up to and including our own. So Stalin's making the point that between 1905 and October 1917, there were long periods of ebbing and flowing of the revolutionary movement, and that it's important to be able to actually analyze what each of these ebbs and flows really are, what they really represent, what's caused them, and how to respond to them. Whereas a dogmatist of the right or the left will simply scream that now the time must be either for full collapse or accelerationism, shall we say, or go into ultra-revolutionary mode. Whereas a serious practitioner of scientific socialism will not be afraid to take the time to analyze a situation before coming to a conclusion, and not just run in with what we would call, in internet language today, a take. So he makes the point, and he says that he answers the point about whether it is true that because capitalism has temporarily stabilized itself, that Lenin's analysis that the world was now in a period of revolution and counter-revolution. And he asked the question, well, was Lenin wrong then? So I'll read the quote to you here. It says, does that mean that the revolution in Europe has begun to ebb? Does this mean that Lenin's thesis concerning a new epoch, the epoch of world revolution, no longer holds good? Does it mean that the proletarian revolution in the West has been cancelled? No, it does not. The whole epoch of world revolution is a new stage of the revolution, a new strategic period, which will last for a number of years, perhaps even a number of decades. During this period, there can and must be ebbs and flows of the revolution. And that's important to bear in mind, because we have gone through I think what I would call a serious period of ebb of the revolutionary tide for most of my lifetime. But again, this shouldn't be a surprise to us if we consider the longer term, and we look at over the longer term history of capitalism. There's been various periods, sometimes for decades at a time, when the revolution and the working class have suffered incredibly horrific defeats and have slid back for decades. Marx even makes the point when he's analyzing the later Paris Commune that the period between the defeat of the French working class by the rise of Napoleon III after 1848 and the heroic stand of the Parisian working class in 1870 in the Paris Commune, there was over 20 years between those two periods, during which the working class was pushed out of the political action almost entirely. So think about our own period now, and think about what Stalin is saying here. Like we've been through a period, roughly speaking, in the West, that is, and I am talking here in Western terms, of relentless defeat, probably from the late 70s through to today. That's over 40 years. That's been assisted by something which Stalin feared would happen, were a correct line not pursued, which is the restoration of capitalism in the land that used to be called the Soviet Union. And were it not for that, then the period of reaction that we've been through would not have lasted as long as it has. I've spoken about this before. However, the point to bear in mind is, and Stalin makes this point in this particular passage, that even when you go through a serious period of ebb in the revolutionary tide, then it will only be followed by an even more ferocious period of a flow in the revolutionary tide. Because, as Stalin points out here, capitalism cannot escape its contradictions. And the imperialist system in our time is riddled with them. And it is only getting worse, and is only getting more unstable, more parasitic as time goes on. So we've been through at least 30 years of a retreat and disaster, and at every stage, various ideological weaklings, opportunists have been screaming for liquidation, for that there can't be communism anymore, that there can only be social democracy, or even just liberalism. Well, none of this is new. Marx observed this in France for 20 years after the defeat of 1848 to 49. And we've observed this, and Stalin himself observes this in the period leading up to 1917. The whole periods where the revolutionary movement appeared to be very much on the back foot, if not completely defeated, but only to see a class struggle re-emerge again in a much more strong fashion than it previously had done. And this is the point he's making, which is because, of course, you have this period between 1917, or late 1917, after the October Revolution, and around about 1923-24, when it looks like there could be revolutions breaking out triumphantly in Hungary, at certain points in Bulgaria, maybe in Italy, certainly in Germany, which had any of those come off, it would have changed the entire dynamic. Certainly in Italy or Germany, and certainly in Hungary too. Should not underestimate the importance of, if there had been a successful revolution in the East, either in Hungary, where there was a Soviet republic for a while, or in Bulgaria, then there could have easily have been a spread of revolution far earlier than there ultimately was. But the point here is that because there'd been this period of revolutionary optimism, which ultimately failed to bring about a Europe-wide revolution for various reasons that we've been through before and will go through again, there was this collapse in optimism inside the Bolshevik Party and inside the Comintern, and it led to all kinds of debates and splits. But what makes Stalin and those like him a great leader is that he is able to contextualize and understand these things, not excusing them, not covering them up, but dealing with the failures head on, as he comes on to talk about, and looking at the fact that, yes, every defeat must be learnt from, but there is no end to the class struggle. Capitalism cannot bring it to an end. So we move on through his dealing with the international situation. He talks about stability. He talks about the stabilization of capitalism and the stabilization of the rule of the Soviets in the USSR. And he talks about the differences in what stabilization means. But what is stabilization? Is it not stagnation? And if it means stagnation, can that term be applied to the Soviet system? No. Stabilization is not stagnation. Stabilization is the consolidation of a given position and a further development. World capitalism has not only consolidated itself in its present position, it is going on and developing further, expanding its sphere of influence and increasing its wealth. It is wrong to say that capitalism cannot develop, that the theory of the decay of capitalism advanced by Lenin in his Imperialism precludes the development of capitalism. Lenin fully proved in his pamphlet Imperialism that the growth of capitalism does not cancel, but presupposes and prepares the progressive decay of capitalism. Thus we have two stabilizations. At one pole, capitalism is becoming stabilized, consolidating the position it has achieved and developing further. At the other pole, the Soviet system is becoming stabilized, consolidating the positions it has won, and advancing further along the road. Who will win? That is the essence of the question. So, the point he's making there is that the question of capitalist decline, the question of the decline of imperialism as a decaying system. And does that preclude the further development of capitalism? Both Lenin and Stalin would have argued no, because decline is not a straight line. It is not just a sudden plunge over a cliff, neither in capitalism nor in any other system. If we deal with a historical comparison, like when did the decline of the Roman Empire start? Did it start with the overthrow of the power of the Senate by Caesar? Did it start after the reign of the end of the reigns of the good emperors? Was it Caligula? Was it the division of the empire in two? There is a long period of decline in many powerful systems that only becomes properly visible in retrospective historical analysis. Now, the decline that Lenin identified with regard to imperialism was such that the way that capitalism has developed in Britain, France, Germany, Italy, to a certain extent Japan, the USA, all of these places capital developed to a point where more profit could be made by exporting capital to places which could be subjected to hyper-exploitation than it could by reinvesting in the home countries. And that period of imperialism that starts roughly in the 1850s but develops into its fullest in the 1880s and 90s marked a high point in the development of capitalism in places like Britain and Germany. Germany comes later, only to see that high point start into a decline. But because so far ahead in terms of development of capitalism, the same is true for the United States. That decline is a circular process, meaning it's a spiral rather than a straight line, meaning that manufacturing capacity, the real economy in the Western nations, the imperialist nations, goes on this long, slow decline, interrupted by periodic spurts of growth toward the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But ultimately, it is a relentless decline. The deindustrialization process identified by Lenin in 1916, drawing on the work of Hobson, the liberal writer, starts in the late 19th century, but doesn't fully manifest itself until like the later 20th century. So like deindustrialization only really becomes like a phenomenon that is noticeable in terms of a relentless trend towards it in the 60s and 70s, and it only really becomes like fully clear how devastating this is going to be by the 90s and the early 2000s. So it's the point here that proves Stalin's analysis is that the deindustrialization, the atomization of society that goes with it, the continual attacks on the working class and the destruction of working class communities, and the continued export of capital is all part of the decay and decline of the imperial core countries. And again, you're only really seeing this in its full scope in the United States over the last really 20 to 25 years. Maybe you could argue a little bit longer, but certainly the decline to the point where even the labor aristocracy in the United States is losing its privileges now is been obvious really since the mid-90s. So the decline is a downward spiral, and it's interrupted by various points of growth. There is still technological development, there is still scientific breakthroughs, but the decline is still there if you know how to actually read these things properly. And now it's becoming incredibly obvious that the profits and the growth screamed about by the imperialists as proof that their system is still working is these are hollow words. A lot of this is just financial manipulation to cover up the fact that they have hollowed out the imperial core countries. So the decline is real. It's the proclaimed triumph of things like globalization in the 90s and 2000s that the capitalists thought was going to be the great revival has turned into its opposite. It's turned into the further hollowing out of their own countries and the actual strengthening of the proletariat in places like, well, China, first and foremost, but also, to a certain degree, places like Indonesia, places like Thailand, places like India, though in all of those cases, the ultimate fate of those countries is a lot less clear than in the case of the Chinese. So the point to make here is that at each stage we've had various different stabilization claims of stabilization from the capitalist class, all of which have turned out to be wrong. This is a point that now can't be denied. Now, Stalin's making the point that the stabilization of the Soviet Union, of course, provides not just an advance to the Soviet proletariat and peasantry, but also to the entire world proletariat and peasantry in terms of an example to follow, and also pressure being exerted upon the ruling class. Now, we'll come back to that later. Now, he goes on to talk about how capital cannot escape its contradictions, and here's a very good quote about the the way in which the contradictions manifest themselves. First of all, on stabilization. Stabilization, says Stalin, under the Soviet system, however, while strengthening socialism, at the same time inevitably leads to an alleviation of contradictions and to an improvement in the relations between the proletariat and the peasantry in our country, and between the proletariat and the colonial peoples of the oppressed countries, and also between the proletarian dictatorship and the workers of all countries. So stabilization in the Soviet case is leading to an increasing strength in the proletariat all over the world, and also in terms of the strengthening of the struggles of the oppressed nations against colonial domination, all of which was proven true by the history of anti-colonial struggles in the 20th century. Now back to the contradictions in the capitalist system, which it cannot escape. Stalin has the following to say. Of course, if there were no law of the uneven development of capitalism, leading to conflicts and wars between the capitalist countries on account of colonies, if capitalism could develop without exporting capital to backward countries, countries where raw materials and labour are cheap, if the surplus capital accumulated in the metropolises were used not for export of capital, but for seriously developing agriculture and for improving the material conditions of the peasantry, and lastly, if this surplus were used for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the entire mass of the working class, there would be no intensification of the exploitation of the working class, no impoverishment of the peasantry under capitalism, no intensification of oppression in colonial and dependent countries, and no conflicts and wars between capitalists. But then capitalism would not be capitalism. The whole point is that capitalism cannot develop without aggravating all of these contradictions, and without thereby developing the conditions which in the final analysis facilitate the downfall of capitalism. The whole point is that the dictatorship of the proletariat, on the contrary, cannot develop without creating the conditions which raise the revolutionary movement in all countries to a higher stage and prepare for the final victory of the proletariat. And that's an excellent point that he's making there in the earlier part of that quote, where he's saying that, and he's addressing really the delusions of the so-called reformers, which is that, yeah, capitalism could in theory stop exporting capital to hyper-exploit less developed areas of the world, could reinvest all of the accumulated capital in the home nations. It could stop, therefore, competing for territory and markets to exploit with other imperialist powers. Capitalism could do all those things. Capitalist politicians could do all those things in theory, but in practice it can't, because it would cease to be capitalism. Because capitalism develops to the point where, again, it has to export capital, and it gets to the point where it seeks to circumvent or cut out commodity production altogether, as identified very early on by Engels. So the whole question of, well, why don't the capitalists do this, that, or the other? Why don't they want to stabilize their system? Don't they want to actually have stable growth and political stability? Oh, yes, they do. On the one level, capitalists want stable investment. They would prefer, perhaps, to invest only in their home countries. They would prefer not to end up in wars with other imperialist powers, because that leads to tremendous destruction and destabilization. Many of them would prefer all of those things. They can't have them, though. They can't do it. Because, again, like, you are in a system which compels you, as a capitalist, to act in a certain way. You're compelled to seek the greatest possible return for the shortest or the smallest possible outlay. You're compelled, by the very nature of the system, to try and find labour that can be subjected to the most brutal forms of exploitation, because in there the profit is the highest. And this means that, of course, all of the dreams of the reformers throughout the 20th century into the 21st century have all turned to dust, even no matter how sincerely that many of them might believe it, because they're asking capitalism to do something which it fundamentally cannot do. It can't do all the things that the Keynesians and the Social Democrats want it to do, because, again, what is capitalism in its essence? It is if we have to boil it down to a few key points. One of them is the extraction of surplus value out of the labor of workers. And you need to maximize the surplus value that you can extract from a worker in order to maximize your profit. And you can't do that unless you can find sources of labor that can be subjected to the most horrific exploitation, that can be forced to work 13, 14, 15-hour days sometimes, that can be forced into working conditions that you might describe as borderline medieval. All of that is, of course, now hidden to some degree because the capitalists in the West, in the imperialist countries, have masterminded and pioneered certain tricks involving outsourcing, subcontracting, offshoring, which keep the source of their profits, i.e. the site of the hyper-exploitation, far away from the imperial core countries. So like, take for example, the extraction of rare earth metals in places like Congo, which is done probably by a subcontractor's subcontractor, which the mobile phone companies will of course claim that they know nothing about, or that they insist on the highest ethical standards from their subcontractors, but not their subcontractors, if you see what I mean. The fact is that the imperialists, in terms of what they're doing, have never can't get over these fundamental laws of capitalism. And the reformers are basically pissing in the wind. They're calling, as Stalin identifies, he's calling for capitalism to do things that would render it non-capitalist. But, and it's the job of communists to clarify these things. So, and the other point about the proletarian dictatorship is Stalin is quite clear all the way through this that the proletarian dictatorship necessitates the party engaging in consistent struggle to win the great and maintain the allegiance of the great masses of the population, not just the proletariat, but the small peasant and the medium peasant. So in Russian terms, the small and medium peasants in the 1920s means those who have like small peasants will be regarded as, of course, the great bulk of the peasantry, who have like either tiny plots of land or like no land at all. And the medium peasant, those who own like maybe enough land to sustain themselves from, or maybe enough to like employ a couple of people on. And Stalin goes on to talk about the need to win over to the side of the proletariat the medium peasants, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But the point is that, and Stalin makes this in the point in the conclusion of the first section, that the machinations of the imperialists in places like China and India, which he cites specifically as in 1925 the imperialists are trying to subjugate them, that even though the revolution might have ebbed, the plots there of the imperialists are still doomed to failure in the end. It's just a question of time and the organization of the proletariat and peasantry and the revolutionary forces. So the point he's making there then flows immediately into the tasks of the communist parties in the capitalist countries. Now here he makes an interesting point, which is worth dwelling on, which is that he says that it's become clear in the task of the task of the communists in the capitalist nations is to actually embed themselves within the working class. And at the time, the best way to do that was to actually work consistently in the trade unions. And if you work consistently in the trade unions, Stalin was arguing, you can actually bring the mass of the workers over to the side of communism. And he has an interesting analysis as to why that's important, which is that the way in which the trade unions and the social democratic parties, such as the Labour Party in this country, was formed was that the trade unions came first. They were around for a good 40 to 50 years at least before the Labour Party, as we would know it today, started to emerge. And Stalin makes an interesting point, saying that this is one of the reasons why the working class allegiance to the trade unions is so strong, because these emerged first, and they are actually in many respects more important than the social democratic parties that spun off them. and that the worker sees the trade unions as his fortress, as Stalin puts it. Now, makes the correct point that unless the communists are prepared to work seriously, and again, this is following on from things that Lenin said, in trade union organizations, no matter how reactionary the leadership might be, then you can't expect to win over the bulk of workers to the Communist Party unless the communists have proven themselves to be effective class fighters inside the trade unions. Now, I think this is still true to this day, even though trade union power in this country is not what it was, and the working class these days has changed its composition. A lot of it has moved from productive to non-productive labor. But the point that Stalin's making there is still true. Now, the mistake that many of the leftists today make is that they mistake trade union activity for bureaucratic activity, meaning that the bulk of the leftists in Britain, some of them are involved in the trade unions. Many of them, though, are engaged in bureaucratic games within the trade union hierarchy. They're not engaged with the base of the unions, and they're not engaged in the basics of organizing workers. They're engaged in trying to win influence within the trade union bureaucracy. So what Stalin's talking about here is winning over workers. What the left does now is try to win positions in the bureaucracy, and those are two very different things that I would emphasize there. And so the other point that he makes here is that is only by actually engaging in this struggle that you're going to win over skeptical workers to the side of revolution. Now, the objection will be raised by some that, well, the great bulk of the working class now isn't in trade union organizations. There's far fewer, proportionally speaking, workers in Britain now engaged in or involved in trade union organization than there was 100 years ago, or 99 years ago when this was written. And that's true in terms of numbers, but in terms of actual ability to impact upon the profits of capital, it's still the organized working class which has the greatest ability to disrupt production. So in terms of high-end manufacturing that still exists in this country, car industry, etc., it's still the organized working class there as the ability to disrupt production, which is why they often still get better deals than the public sector workers. It's still the organised working class in transport, for instance, trains, buses, etc., who have the ability to disrupt the system more. And it's still the organised working class that actually is the working class that's organised in the trade unions that has taken at least the small first step to actually organising itself and becoming a class for itself, to use Marx's old term. So this argument still does largely apply. Yes, there are other organisations of the working class. There are breakthrough unions, smaller unions, revolutionary unions. But unfortunately, we're still in a situation where the great bulk of the working class in Britain and in other countries too is still organised in these traditional trade unions. And if you're not active there, then you're missing out on where the great bulk of day-to-day class struggle takes place. So for that reason, and again, we debate this amongst ourselves constantly, it's still the case that Stalin's advice still holds. So, and he does correctly identify the fact that I think he's still true to this day, that social democracy is still where it is because it has the trade unions behind it. The Labour Party, even though it is, of course, the reserve team of the British ruling class, would not be able to do anything without without the trade unions behind it. Even though it gets billionaire money these days with that useless, corrupt arsehole Keir Starmer in charge, without the trade unions behind it, not just in terms of money, but in terms of organisational muscle, in terms of providing the bureaucracies that run the Labour Party, in terms of turning out people to go and volunteer for it. It's all the trade unions that comes from. So without the trade unions, there is no Labour Party. That's manifestly the case. So if you break one or two of the unions away from the Labour Party, we've managed to do that, that's a huge step forward. Because, again, it's a step forward to killing this thing. Because without the trade unions behind it, There is no Labour Party in this country. There is no Social Democratic Party, and that's why, for those of us in countries where this arrangement between the trade unions and the Social Democratic Party still exists, breaking that relationship means destroying the Social Democratic Party. So we should keep this in mind, and also bear this in mind, because when we're asked, like, why do we talk so much about trade unions? Why do we talk so much about the need to break the link with the Social Democratic Party, in our case the Labour Party? It's because, again, without that, as Stalin notes, without the trade unions, there's no Labour Party. Always was the case. And so the more we can do to break that away, break the unions from the Labour Party, the better. Ruling class understand that too, which is why they would be very opposed to breaking the unions away from the Labour Party, despite the frenetic and foaming at the mouth madness that comes from the right wing of the bourgeoisie in this country. The more sensible bourgeois understand very well that having the unions shackled to the Labour Party is a big advantage for them. Right, moving then to point 3 in Stalin's article, which is the tasks of the communists in the colonial and dependent countries. And here he makes an interesting point, which I think is still true to this day. Excuse me. Sorry. And he talks about the fact that there is a struggle going on, and this, bear in mind, he's writing this in 1925, over the fate of the revolutions and the campaigns for independence in the subjugated and colonized countries. And he makes the point about the emergence of a comprador layer in places like Egypt, places like India, and other colonized nations, that as the export of capital from the imperial core countries increases, then there emerges within the colonized nations a element in the bourgeois that is completely tied to, in terms of its profits, in terms of therefore its class interests, to continuing the subjugated relationship with imperialism. And this is what we call compradors. This is where they come from. So their origin is in the fact that they are profiting directly from the export of capital from the imperial core countries, and therefore their interest is in the continuing the subjugation of those nations as long as they get to continue their relationship with the imperialists. And that's true to this day. If you've got a layer in the ruling class in any particular country that is dependent upon, have their profits dependent upon dealings with the imperialists, then they're going to continue to support the subjugation of their country under the thumb of the imperialists. And again, true then, true now. And this is an ongoing issue with regard to the colonized nations. But what Stalin states, and again he's following on from Marx and Engels here, is that the job of the communists in the subjugated nations is to, well, as Mao did, identify the potential allies and identify the enemies. The potential allies do lie in those elements within the bourgeois when it comes to national liberation, whose interests take them in another direction, whose interests take them towards supporting national liberation. And the communists should seek to work with those, but the communists should not subjugate the Communist Party under the leadership of the bourgeois forces. They should continue to grow the Communist Party as an independent organization, should continue to bring the workers towards it and peasants towards it and educate them in how to become class fighters. Now, the difference between that and the later approach of some communists in Latin America and Europe, in fact, is that when this was applied opportunistically by the Khrushchevites later, they started advising basically that communists subjugate themselves and their organizations behind bourgeois factions and cease to operate independently. That was never what the Comintern advice was in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s when it comes to United Front organizations. It was always that if you can unify in subjugated countries with the progressive elements of the bourgeoisie with national bourgeois figures, then if that's possible to do, then it should be done. But that does not come at the expense of the Communist Party organization. And what started to go wrong after World War II, and particularly after the death of Stalin and the rise of the Khrushchevites, was that they started to value the alliance with the bourgeois above everything else, including the development of the party in these countries. So, then moves on to talk about the development of socialism in the Soviet Union. This is point 4. And he here makes the point about the absolute requirement for the proletariat to actually build and strengthen the alliance with the middle peasantry. And here he talks about, he re-emerges, of course, our old friend Trotsky. And he was talking about, talks about the peasantry and the fact that Trotsky takes this dismissive attitude towards the peasantry, which of course we've talked about before. But also he talks again about the prospects of socialism in one country. And what Stalin's point is here is that whereas Trotsky and others collapsed into pessimism after the defeat of the German Revolution in the early 1920s and started proclaiming loudly that it was impossible to build socialism in one country, Stalin's point in response to this is that it is possible, as the Soviet Union showed, to build a socialist system inside one country, to build the dictatorship of the proletariat inside one country. And this does not mean, as Stalin emphasizes, that you abandon all hopes of world revolution, but that without consolidating the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union, then at that time and now, then and this as I mean, what I mean by the now is this applies certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We can see how true this is, that without the Soviet Union as a base for revolution, then the struggle of the proletariat gets sent backwards. And Stalin quotes from Lenin as saying that the example of the Soviet Union, even in times of an ebbing of the revolutionary tide, the example of the Soviet Union in terms of its great triumphs in development will inspire the proletariat in the West, in both the imperialist countries and the subjugated colonized nations. The example of Soviet power will provide an impetus for class struggle just by existing. And again, the imperialists understood that. They understood that as long as the Soviet Union existed, even in the compromised form that it came to be later on after the death of Stalin, even in the mess that Khrushchev made of it, even in the elements of decay that existed under Brezhnev, even up to the early 1980s, the fact that the Soviet Union was still there, still had a somewhat planned economy, even with all the pro-capitalist elements that Khrushchev and his followers and the revisionists had placed in there. Even with all of that, it still provided inspiration to countless struggles across the world, especially in the subjugated nations of the world. And this was, of course, a large part of the reason why they absolutely could not allow the Soviet Union to exist. And again, as Stalin observed, I think it was in his interview with H.G. Wells, that if the Soviet Union disappeared, there would be decades of the blackest reaction to follow. And this is indeed what happened. And this is indeed why the actions of the Gorbachev layer were so incredibly treacherous, because many in the Soviet Union, unfortunately not enough, it would seem, were aware of the fact that imperialism could not help but be hostile to the Soviet Union. Therefore, whether it's Khrushchev, whether it's Kosygin and Brezhnev, or later on, more disastrously, Gorbachev, peddling this lie that you could have long-term rapprochement with imperialism, or that there would be a merger between communism and social democracy, or that there would be long-term peace would be possible. All of this was a lie. It was a complete lie. You can reach a temporary bargain with imperialism from time to time, if you have to. And that's all you can ever reach. You cannot turn off the hostility of imperialism towards socialism, because imperialism cannot have a situation where not only is a huge portion of the world with a giant amount of very valuable resources within it sealed off from exploitation, as the Soviet Union was, but also that is acting as inspiration for uprisings across the colonized world. You can't have that if you're an imperialist. No matter what Willy Brandt or Helmut Schmidt or Mitterrand or even JFK himself might have said or even believed, none of those people can turn around the nature of the imperialist system. You can't switch it off. You can't ask it to stop being imperialism, to refer to what Stalin said earlier. So, Trotsky, I mean, this is where you get into the argument between Trotsky and the majority in the Bolshevik Party, or in the Communist Party at the time. Trotsky's insistence that you can't build socialism in one country is manifestly wrong. Again, the 5-year plans proved that. What Stalin says is, what is true is that you can't guarantee the final victory without victories of revolutions all the way across the rest of the world, particularly in the destruction of imperialism. And that is true. So again, what you get a lot with Trotsky is that there's elements of truth in some of what he says. So like and this is what Stalin is saying, there's an element of truth in the idea that you can't have a final victory without the total conquest of capitalism, or I should say more specifically, without the defeat of imperialism. You can't secure full victory in the Soviet Union or any socialist country without the defeat of imperialism, specifically US imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism. And so that's true. But then Trotsky, because he, if we're going to be charitable, is a hysterical ultra-leftist sometimes and an ultra-rightist at other times, takes that element of truth and goes far too far with it. It goes so far too far with it by arguing you can't possibly even start to build socialism in one country without a revolution in an advanced country. And Stalin's point, following on from Lenin, is not only can you do it, but it is a way for you to strengthen the revolution in these countries if you do so successfully. And Stalin was proved right. The only reason we in the West had welfare capitalism, or a national health service, we in Britain that is, was precisely because of the success of the Soviet Union, the success of the planned economy, and the inspiration it provided to the domestic working class here. That, combined with a few with other twists and turns in the historical story here, provided the impetus for the reform programs after World War II. That's what caused it. It was the very success of the Soviet Union which caused the capitalists to desperately embrace the need for some kind of reform to buy themselves time. And that, again, proves the point correct. And the other point that's proven correct is Lenin's point, which is that you can build socialism, you can have the dictatorship of the proletariat, but again, you have to constantly reinforce that, because imperialism cannot help but always be at your door, desperately plotting, scheming, and agitating against you. There can be no question of final victory until imperialism is destroyed. But again, the best way to destroy imperialism is to provide a strong example for the working class to follow, the working class in the imperialist countries to follow, knowing full well that the contradictions of imperialism will cause explosions of class struggle. And if they have the living example of a socialist state right there in front of them, then the working class can see through the lies of the bourgeoisie more easily. So that when he's talking about and he's arguing against Trotsky, those are the points that Stalin is making. So he goes on to talk about what the final victory of socialism is. And here I will read a quote to you. What is the final victory of socialism? The final victory of socialism is the full guarantee against attempts at intervention, and hence against restoration. For any serious attempt at restoration can take place only with serious support from outside, only from the support of international capital. Therefore, the support of our revolution by the workers of all countries, and still more, the victory of the workers in at least several countries, is a necessary condition for fully guaranteeing the first victorious country against attempts at intervention and restoration, a necessary condition for the final victory of socialism. So, the point here that Stalin is making is that, yes, there can be no final victory until the rest of the capitalist world comes to socialism. But again, that doesn't mean you should not build socialism inside the USSR, which is the pessimistic and the defeatist attitude of Trotsky and the ultra-lefts. Now, the point that has to be come back to here with regards to the later Gorbachev period is that the Gorbachev period is possible because of two conditions. First of all, internal decay in the Soviet party, to the point where a buffoonish idiot like Gorbachev could rise to the top. But also because he and the clique that was around him were directly supported by imperialism. And without the support of imperialism, there would have been no restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Seems rather obvious, but it must be emphasized. So, we move on to talk about the party's policy in the countryside. And here, Stalin makes an excellent point to start off with, which we're going to read in full, because it was worth dwelling on for quite some time. So, he talks about the way in which the bourgeois press in Britain and America went hysterical because the Bolshevik Party started to or was in the process of self-criticism in 1925, and Stalin makes the point that that addressing the party's shortcomings is actually a strength, not a weakness. And here I will read this quote in full. Self-criticism is a sign of our party's strength and not of its weakness. Only a strong party, which has its roots in life and is marching to victory, can afford the ruthless criticism of its own shortcomings that it has permitted and always will permit in front of the whole people. A party which hides the truth from the people, which fears the light and fears criticism, is not a party but a clique of impostors whose doom is sealed. Messieurs, the bourgeois measure us with their own yardstick. They fear the light and assiduously hide the truth from the people, covering up their shortcomings with ostentatious proclamations of well-being. And so they think that we communists too must hide the truth from the people. They fear the light, for it would be enough for them to permit anything like serious self-criticism, anything like free criticism of their own shortcomings, to cause the downfall of the bourgeois system. And so they think that if we communists permit self-criticism, it is a sign that we are surrounded and that the ground is slipping from under our feet. Those honourable gentlemen, the bourgeois and social democrats, measure us with their own yardsticks. Only parties which are departing into the past and whose doom is sealed can fear the light and fear criticism. We fear neither the one nor the other. We do not fear them because we are a party that is in the ascendant, that is marching to victory. That is why the self-criticism that has been going on for several months already is a sign of our party's immense strength and not of its weakness. It is a means of consolidating and not of disintegrating the party. So, what is the thing to bear in mind here? First of all, if you read that quote out to most people, they wouldn't think it was from Stalin. Because Stalin was, of course, insistent throughout his time as General Secretary that vigorous and rigorous self-criticism be applied in the party and up to the highest levels of the leadership. Second of all, what differentiates this self-criticism and this ability to do it from the fake reforms and so-called democratizations of the Khrushchev and the Gorbachev period? So let's dwell upon that, because it was a question posed by somebody in the Telegram chat, and I think it's worth addressing. So if you read that out and said it was a Gorbachev quote, some people would believe you. But what is the distinguishing feature here of Stalin's self-criticism? Stalin, of course, is an ardent defender of proletarian democracy, meaning that the failures of the party and the state are discussed in full and in front of the working class, with the idea being that the worker is part of this discussion and is part of this process of actually learning from the errors and doing so in a way to strengthen proletarian rule. and that it is a vital part of the rule of the Communist Party that it always seeks to constantly integrate and enhance the role of the worker and the peasant in the management of the party and the state. Now, how is that different to what Khrushchev proclaimed later on and what Gorbachev proclaimed later with so-called glasnost and so-called perestroika? In each of these, and this continued in the Brezhnev period as well, in each of these periods, what was being done was not self-criticism in order to actually strengthen the rule of the working class and draw more of the workers into the management of the state, the party, the economy. What was being done was bourgeois counter-revolutionary elements were being brought into the system. To a certain extent under Khrushchev, kind of continued under Brezhnev, but really manifested itself under Gorbachev. So Gorbachev liked to hide behind quotes from Lenin. He didn't use quotes from Stalin. But apparently he'd never read a single work of Lenin's. He'd read a book of quotations. I mean, to call the guy stupid is to do stupid people a disservice. But glasnost and perestroika, what were they? They hid behind Leninist slogans, but what were they really? Were they ways to further enhance the role of the working class, to raise the cultural and educational level of the working class, to enable greater working class participation in the system, to restore the dictatorship of the proletariat? No. They were the opposite. They were designed to destroy the remaining elements of proletarian rule and replace it with the what I will call the bullshit of bourgeois democracy. That's what glasnost and perestroika were, and they had their roots in earlier maneuvers done by in the Brezhnev and the Khrushchev period. So Stalin and Mao always insisted that their the self-criticism that they were in favor of, was dependent upon playing this out in front of the masses, with the masses directly participating in this. Same is true for Castro and Cuba. Same is true for Kim Il Sung and the communists and the DPRK. What you get from someone like, not just Gorbachev, but someone like a fraud like Dubček in Czechoslovakia, is bringing in bourgeois structures where the failures and first of all, the failures are not discussed in a way to strengthen the system, but to destroy it. Secondly, they are not discussed properly in front of the proletariat. They are discussed amongst circles of wannabe bourgeois intellectuals and wannabe bourgeois media figures. That's what Gorbachev and Yakovlev's free media campaigns were all about, creating sources of support for bourgeois rule that would only further bourgeois rule. Whereas if you compare that to what was done in Cultural Revolutionary China or in the earlier in the Soviet Union, the errors were discussed in massive meetings in front of proletarians and peasants who were playing a direct role in that criticism. They were not discussed via bourgeois circles of intellectuals. Intellectuals were involved in the process, but were involved in the process on an equal footing to the proletarian and the peasant. That's the difference. And you see like how people can be led astray, who are even people who are well-meaning, into revisionism because they don't fully study the class content of things. People who don't properly study the class content of things can get led into supporting revisionism if it dresses itself up in revolutionary phrases, which is what Khrushchev did, which is what Gorbachev did. And it is a failure in the Soviet party that there were too few people who were of an advanced level, who had an advanced understanding of Marxism, who were perhaps well-intentioned, who got drawn into Khrushchevism, and another layer later on who were perhaps dirtier, who got drawn into the Gorbachev period, thinking they were engaging in some kind of system revival, whereas in actual fact they were engaging in ways to destroy it. And what strengthens proletarian rule is, let's go back to fundamentals, and this is what Stalin is doing here. Not just exposing failures, but exposing them in a very specific way. Talking about the failures in the sense that this did not actually lead us towards socialism. That this was actually an era that took us away from building socialism, that took us away from building proletarian power. Discussing the eras in such a way should be done in such a way to draw in more workers into the discussion about why things failed, to learn from the masses and to take that back into the party and the state, and then to come up with a solution that incorporates the view of the masses, then bring it back for further discussion and embracing by the masses. This was what was being done in the 20s and the 30s, and this is what made possible the enormous successes of the 5-year plans, is this role of the masses in the system. Now that, as Stalin observes when he's talking about the building of socialism, he's talking about how there is always going to be an enemy of the masses in terms of the officialdom, and he talks about this when he's talking about the policy in the countryside. He says, the communists in the countryside must refrain from improper forms of administration. We must not rely merely on giving orders to the peasants. We must learn to explain to the peasants patiently the questions they do not understand. We must learn to convince the peasants, sparing neither time nor effort for this purpose. Of course, it is much easier and simpler to issue an order and leave it at that, as some of our Volost executive committee chairmen often do. But not all that is simple and easy is good. Not long ago, it appears, when the representative of the Gubernia Committee asked the secretary of a Volost party unit why there were no newspapers in his Volost, the answer was given. What do we want newspapers for? It's quieter and better without them. If the peasants begin reading newspapers, they will start asking all sorts of questions, and we will have no end of trouble with them. And this secretary calls himself a communist. It scarcely needs proof that he is not a communist, but a calamity. The point is that nowadays it is utterly impossible to lead without trouble, let alone without newspapers. This simple truth must be understood and assimilated if we want the party and the Soviet power to retain the leadership in the countryside. Now, that's crucial to understand, because what Stalin's doing there is he's outlining like the failures that would later follow, which is that you have to insist that if the party is going to win the allegiance of what Stalin identifies as a crucial layer, which is the middle peasants, then you have to do this via getting out there into getting the party cadre out there into the areas where it is weak amongst the middle and the smaller peasants, and bringing them around to the point of view of the party by persuasion. And that's what needed to be done throughout the 1920s. This is what was being done to prepare the ground for collectivization later. See, Trotsky, in his bureaucratic approach, was screaming that there needed to be collectivization, needed to be done now, needed to be done by an order from Moscow. Stalin's approach is to, or I should say the majority of the party's approach, is to say, even though collectivization it might be necessary, it has to be done, but at with the peasants themselves driving the process after the party's position with the peasantry has been strengthened. And that can only be done via embedding the party within the peasant masses. You see the difference? It's the same, nominally the same objective, which is collectivization, but wholly different methods to go about it. One of which is driven by the peasants because they've been won over to this point of view. The other one of which involves giving bureaucratic and administrative diktats. That was Trotsky's point of view. And so Trotsky is portrayed as this sort of great leftist, but every single time when it comes down to it, what he's all about is actually issuing directives and orders. Did that with the trade union question in 1921, does that consistently with the peasant question. Because Trotsky's view is is that the peasantry is there, and the workers, to be honest, are there to take orders from an enlightened few, led by himself. So, I'll conclude here by, on this particular point, by quoting further from Stalin, who says, it is impossible to lead in the old way, because the peasants are displaying more political activity, and it is necessary that this activity should assume a Soviet form, that it should flow through the Soviets and not past them. A leader is one who revitalizes the Soviets and creates a peasant active around the party in the countryside. It is impossible to lead in the old way nowadays because the economic activity of the rural population has increased, and it is necessary that this activity should assume the form of cooperation, and it should flow through the cooperatives and not past them. A leader is one who implants a cooperative communal life in the countryside. So the point here is, and again, that this was in the period of the new economic policy. The new economic policy was starting to work in terms of the increase in grain production in the Soviet countryside. But at the same time, it was increasing the power of the speculators, and it was increasing the power of the bigger landowners, the kulaks. And that Stalin and the majority of the party realized that this had to be counteracted, because as the profits of the kulaks increased, the power of the kulaks increased. And they started winning the layers of the middle peasantry over to them. And this needed to be tackled. It could only be tackled by winning over both the small peasant and the medium peasant away from the influence of the kulak. And when he talks about the political life in the countryside flowing, there was a danger of it flowing past the Soviets and not through them, that's what he's referring to. That the political life comes to be dominated by the kulaks. And that needed to be ended. And so there needed to be a struggle in the countryside, as there was throughout the middle to later 1920s, which manifested in essentially a class war in the countryside, with the small and the medium peasants going against the kulak by 1929. So that collectivization, we had the ground prepared for it for at least 4 years before the struggle for it eventually broke out. And that the struggle for it was led, in many areas, by the small peasants. And the struggle to take the land off the kulaks, who continued acts of sabotage and destruction against against agriculture in the Soviet countryside for years to come. Point about it is, though, and this is the point that Stalin emphasizes, that it takes continued struggle to win, retain, and then maintain, and then win again the allegiance of these different layers in the population. And therefore, the life of a party member is one of constant struggle. It is one of constantly having to learn, constantly having to study, constantly having to engage in struggle, constantly engaging with the masses. And it is an unrewarding life in the sense of the material. And that is what, interestingly enough, something that the Chinese party started to emphasize very heavily a decade ago, that the life of a communist is not a way to get rich, whereas previously under the Jiang Zemin and in the Hu Jintao period, it was seen by some as a way of getting rich. So that's an interesting development in China, which comes with much promise attached to it. So the general point here is that what Stalin is emphasizing is that he's making a point about to properly analyzing and responding to the ebbs in the revolutionary situation internationally, and in domestically, how that the development of socialism in the Soviet Union is not only possible but absolutely necessary. If there is ever to be a victory of the wider revolution, it has to take inspiration from the center of world revolution, that is the USSR, and and the USSR leads through this by increasing its economic successes. The gigantic successes of the 5-year plans, which were to follow, provided inspiration and terror for the proletariat in the West and in the subjugated colonized countries, and terrified the life out of the imperialist ruling classes. This point of view that Stalin is expressing here was proven to be manifestly correct. Trotsky, yet again, wrong. Okay, so that's Stalin's article in Pravda, printed on May the 12th and May the 13th, 1925. And next week, we'll be going on to his report at the 14th Congress of the CPSUB. And that's from December 18th to the 31st, 1925. And that's his response to the people like Kamenev, Sokolnikov, Zinoviev, and Trotsky. So that's next week. Now I'm going to pause to take a few questions. Right. So there was about 45 minutes of music before this program started, so I hope you all enjoyed that. So we have Svetlana joining us from Moscow. Comradely greetings to you. And Svetlana starts with a question asking, Lenin was concerned that the party would be filled with opportunists, but do you agree that Stalin was right to contradict Lenin and greatly expand the party apparatus, given that as Stalin saw at the time of the revolutionary theoreticians had passed and the workhorses were now more important? Well, I think what Stalin saw, as typified by that article we've just worked through, was that the party, after the victory in the Civil War, had become very weak in a lot of areas, particularly weak in the countryside. And that therefore you needed an expanded party to recruit people to go out there and do the work of winning, especially the peasants, over to the alliance with the proletariat, which was a very real risk of collapsing after the early 1920s and war communism. And that with the introduction of the NEP after 1921, the risk of collapse was furthered because the NEP brings with it a series of risks, which include the growth in the influence of the kulaks and the speculators. And you have to rebuild the party in the countryside and engage in a struggle. And you can't do that without having people available to you. So the Lenin intake, immediately after Lenin's death, which saw many, many hundreds of thousands join up, was necessary because you needed people to go out there and be cadres in the countryside especially. And you needed also to rebuild the party following the Civil War and all that had followed it. So Lenin's concern was that the party would get filled up with opportunists. And that was a concern that Stalin clearly shared because he's talking about, in that article we've just gone through, the need to battle against opportunism, shortcuts, and corruption, and bureaucratism. But again, without the expansion, without the Lenin intake in 1924, they wouldn't have been able to carry out the struggle in the countryside that ultimately led to collectivization, and also that supported the building out and the strengthening of the party that enabled it to carry through the work of the 5-year plans and industrialization. The point, again, to go back to the point of difference with Trotsky, Trotsky was so convinced of his own genius that he thought that if he just issued a directive, then industrialization and collectivization would follow. Stalin knew that at each stage before those could be done, there needed to be a political, an ideological struggle, a class struggle, to win over these different layers of the Soviet population to these points of view before you could engage in that struggle. So it's Stalin who's the actual revolutionary, and Trotsky who's the bureaucrat. Greetings to Grassy Knoll and Comrade Jawad out there in sunny Dorset. Davey joins us, and he's having an interesting time combining socialist classics whilst watching Oldham Athletic. Is this a first? Probably not. I'm going to bet there's been a few communist Oldham supporters over the years. I think you'd need revolutionary optimism to be a fan of Oldham Athletic these days. Luis joins us from Portugal. Krasavets says, hello, comrades. Privyet, tovarish. To you, indeed. Hello to someone who's got an unpronounceable name in Greek. If I had 10 more minutes, I'd be able to read it, but I can't. So greetings to you, comrade. Muzzle Paint, greetings to you. Jack Jones, greetings to you out there in Milwaukee. John Barleycorn, hello to you. Good morning to Jenny, who joins us from the US of A. And good afternoon to Imran, who joins us as well. Svetlana asks, Stalin understood the workers that socialism meant a better life for them. The socialism of Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev was more about theory and book reading. Is that a fair generalization? Well, if Trotsky was a great theoretician, then why is all his theory so bad? I mean, that's a distinction I've seen drawn before, but again, like, Stalin had an all-around understanding of the questions here, meaning that, yes, Stalin understood that life for the workers and peasants had to improve. Without that, then there would be no question of the communists continuing to hold the support of either. But unlike someone like Bukharin or later Khrushchev, Stalin understood that an improvement in the material conditions of the workers had to go along with a consistent struggle to raise the educational and cultural level of the worker and the peasant in order that they could play their part in the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that this is what marks Stalin out from so many others. That yes, he understood that material life had to improve, but also that as a key part of that struggle to improve material conditions, the worker had to have his cultural level raised, had to be part of the administering of the state. Like Khrushchevism is bureaucratism because it seeks to reverse that. It becomes less and less interested, revisionism this is, as time goes on, in raising the cultural level, in actually bringing more workers into the party and the state, in involving more workers in the planning process. Khrushchevism, much like, which is why Khrushchev is actually a Trotskyite, stems from a social democratic deviation, a bureaucratic deviation, which seeks to push the workers out of the administration of the state, which is why Khrushchev declares a state of the whole people rather than a dictatorship of the proletariat in, I think it's 1961. The point about this is that Stalin understood that the material improvement is not separate from political engagement, and that the two have to advance together. And if you become one-sided about it, so emphasizing, as Khrushchev and others did, a sort of very crude material improvement that is based on trying to ape what was seen as the success of capitalism in the 50s and the 60s, then what you'll end up with is destroying the dictatorship of the proletariat, as they did, and also ruining and destroying the revolutionary consciousness and spirit of the proletariat and the peasantry, which is what they ended up doing. And that's the distinction. That's what makes Stalin and Mao great leaders. And as for Trotsky, well, he went back and forth on all of these things. He would scream loudly that he was in favor of the most revolutionary interpretation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then he'd collaborate with right-wingers who wanted the opposite, who wanted a restoration of bourgeois rule. So again, like, it's typical to dismiss Trotsky as like a theorizer, but his theories are all terrible. So he might have been a bookworm, but he certainly didn't draw very good conclusions. Zinoviev and Kamenev were waverers. Like, they were defined by the fact that they just went back and forth from one thing to the other. They were always theoretically weak and politically weak as well. Like, they tried to run away from the decision to even stage the uprising in October 1917. So I don't think it's strictly true to just describe those as the theory heavy guys. What defined Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev is, to varying degrees, that these were all waverers, and they had all of them very little faith in the Soviet masses. Stalin, as you say, Svetlana, did understand the workers, and he did understand the need to create material improvements, but he also understood the true meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which meant that the workers and also the peasants should come to rule, whereas Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, what defined them was really a belief in bureaucratic and administrative methods, and they shared that with Bukharin. Tim Gray, good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to Jack Jones. Svetlana says, statues of Stalin are cropping up all over Russia. In August, Krasnodar region erected a statue of 3.5 meters in height, bringing the number of Stalin statues in Russia today to at least 115. Well, certainly does seem that the reputation of Stalin has been, if not largely restored, then he's getting restored progressively as time goes on. Movie Maker Joe, good evening or good afternoon to you. More Time Needed joins us from Skeggy on the East Coast Riviera. Yes, Jenny, NAFO and EU trolls are the most disgusting people around. That's why so many of them are sex offenders. Edward asks, where's the Latvian socialist music? Challenge accepted. There'll be Latvian socialist music on the program tomorrow. Svetlana says the debate continues here. Should Volgograd be renamed Stalingrad? Suggestion has been made the residents of Volgograd should decide. Well, my personal opinion, even though I'm not a resident there, clearly, would be that they should, and it would be big. It would be big news if they did. I mean, it would point to the resurgence of the reputation of Stalin and the Stalin period. I mean, I wonder how long that the Russian government itself can maintain in some of the fictions that they engaged in about the Stalin period. How long, for instance, are they going to persist with the forgeries created by people like Yakovlev and Shevardnadze regarding the Katyn massacre? How long are they going to persist with the fictions that they started to tell regarding the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Well, notice now that the Russian Foreign Ministry is defending the Soviet government's actions over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the moving of Soviet forces into what's now Belarus as in 1939 to 40, and is defending it in terms that were pretty familiar from the Stalin period. So I wonder how long that the Russian government can persist with the pretense that the Katyn massacre was carried out by Soviets and not Nazis, which it was carried out by them, and other things that Putin and Medvedev and others have engaged in over the years in order, just as Shevardnadze said, to improve relations with the West by basically lying about the Soviet past. Interesting to see how long they can keep the remaining myths that they've endorsed in the past up and alive. Krasovet says the hypocrisy of Brits cheering on the dismantling of Soviet memorials yet complain about slave trader statues being torn down. Well, it's just a matter of recognising where the class interests lie. Look, the British ruling class understand that a lot of their fortunes come from slave trading. That's why they revere the slave traders still. No matter, forget all the woke shit. The woke shit doesn't matter. It's just something for the petty bourgeoisie to get excited about. The actual ruling class, the people who own things in this country, who really own things, most of them will find their ancestors were involved in the slave trade. They know it. They know that their money came from that. A lot of it did anyway. Whereas, and that's why they get upset about the slave traders' statues being torn down, because that's the statues of their class ancestors and sometimes direct ancestors. They cheer the dismantling of memorials to the Soviet war dead and to the Soviet leaders because they correctly view those as memorials to their enemies. So they understand the system. They understand the meaning of symbolism. And so they cheer on things. They cheer on the destruction of the monuments to socialism. Why wouldn't they cheer that on? Again, they should always view this as they do. They cheer on the destruction of things that are viewed as inimical to their interests. We cheer on the destruction of things that are inimical to our interests. It's a class war. There's no hard and fast principles regarding statues. It's just what they represent. Good afternoon to James Goblin, who joins us from the once and future Yugoslavia. Christopher Rogers joins us from the People's Republic of China. Davud Kubaya joins us. Hello to you. Jerry, good afternoon to you. Good morning to Verena Fraser from California. And Kato joins us from Taiwan. And let's have a look who else is with us. T.L. Lorca looks like they're going to be sick when they mentioned Gorbachev's Pizza Hut advert. James Goblin also joins us on X for the algorithm. Hello to all 185 of you watching on X and 119 on YouTube. Not sure how many on Rumble, but it is available on Rumble at the moment. No forgetting there was a miners' strike in Britain in 1919 and a miners' strike in the US in 1919, points out Tim Gray. Very good point. Most of the reforms that FDR put into place were undone during Bill Clinton's presidency, says Gracianol, which is true. I think it started under Carter, though, to be completely fair. Svetlana says, Trotsky wrote, not every exasperated petty bourgeois would become Hitler, but a particle of Hitler is lodged in every exasperated petty bourgeois. Would you agree? it's a good phrase, but it's not. Again, it shows Trotsky's misunderstanding of fascism. Like fascism comes from the bourgeois. Like as I said in the episode regarding World War II, yeah, Hitler came from the petty bourgeois, but he was an employee of the German bourgeois from 1918 onwards. So Trotsky gives fascism far more credit than it deserves. I mean, it might be worth doing a critique of Trotsky's writings on fascism at some point. So, I mean, he puts a lot of it down to the petty bourgeois. Now, the petty bourgeois, it's true, were herded behind fascism by the bourgeoisie. So Hitler is a bourgeois creation. And I think the problem in Trotsky's writings is that he treats fascism as almost a legitimate petty bourgeois movement, whereas in actual fact it's always a creation of the bourgeoisie themselves. They find a Hitler or a Mussolini or a Franco to front it up for them, but it is just the most violent and brutal expression of their class rule that is put into place to get them out of a deep, deep crisis. And so I'd say that's a very neat phrase. But as always with Trotsky, it's a neat phrase that covers up theoretical sloppiness. And I think it's necessary probably for us to go over Trotsky's work on fascism and point out the errors in it. Hello to YepX. Hello to Otis. Hello to Robert Hand joining us from Gainesville, Florida. Is Florida the Sunshine State? Is that its nickname? CE, good afternoon to you in NATO-occupied Sweden. Svetlana says, Bukharin supported Stalin against Kamenev and Zinoviev at the 14th Congress. So is it odd he later opposed Stalin's collectivization? Surely he could see rapid industrialization meant collectivization. Bukharin's change, Bukharin was in an alliance to a degree with Stalin at the 14th Congress. The change was that Bukharin was consistently defending the NEP. So Stalin and the majority of the party at the 14th Congress were defending the continuation of the NEP against Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, and later on who became the United Opposition, as it was called. And Bukharin continued to defend the kulaks and the NEP into 1929, much later. If you notice, the difference is that whereas Bukharin saw in the NEP a path to essentially the Soviet Union becoming some form of social democracy. I mean, he was the originator, really, of the trend that would be taken on by Gorbachev and then fully manifested under Gorbachev, I should say. Bukharin sticks to the pro-capitalist line, whereas Stalin and others saw it as necessary to boost grain production and restart industrial production, to do a temporary retreat, whilst building up the power of the party in the peasantry and again in the working class, to then push on to collectivization later. Now, Bukharin, I think, and again, can't see inside the man's head, would have been in a block with Stalin, because that meant basically continuing on with the NEP at that stage. He then falls foul of the majority in the party when the time comes to do rapid industrialization and collectivization from 1929 onwards. So, 14th Congress, he's there arguing essentially in alliance with Stalin and the others to continue the NEP. But I guess my guess is that he thought that he would be able to persuade the Congress later on to continue, and that there would never be collectivization or rapid industrialization. So it's a matter of the fact that to draw from Mao, the class war continues, and it continues intensely in the party after the revolution. As the phrase from the Cultural Revolution goes, the bourgeoisie is in the party. And the bourgeoisie was indeed represented in the party in the form of Bukharin, who took more and more specifically pro-capitalist positions up to 1929 to 30. So, and again, like what Stalin and Lenin saw as a temporary retreat to pro-capitalist to capitalist reforms, Bukharin saw as the way forward. I hope that answers your question. When will the period of revolutionary upheaval come? Asks Edward. I don't like putting timelines on things, Edward, but in our case, I'm going to take a punt and say within the next 5 years, even in Britain. The crisis here is indeed very deep. So maybe we could do a whole episode on when will the revolutionary upsurge come. A lot of the conditions are there to make it, but there are certain conditions which are absent. So I'm going to say within the next 5 years there will be an upsurge in class struggle, a dramatic upsurge in class struggle. As to whether we are in a position to maximize the potential within that, that's another question. Krasovet says September 1923 in Bulgaria was a 2-week communist uprising which was crushed. Good point. YepX says, do you know that today marks the 106th anniversary of the Battle of Megiddo? Long before Israel even existed, the British Empire attacked Turkish armies near Nablus in Palestine. Yep, and then we're already recruiting the Zionists as their later foot soldiers. Can fascists, working class fascists, be reprogrammed? Asks Edward. They can be won over to the cause of the proletariat. Yeah, of course they can. I mean, I've met some ex-fascists who've become communists. It's like the transformation in consciousness is not so great. In reality, it's just a matter of them having to let go of certain mythologies. The problem with a lot of people is they get themselves so far into that hole they can't come out again. Grassy Knoll says the AFL-CIO is still supporting the Democratic Party in the US even after the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton put NAFTA in place, which is why the entire leadership of the AFL-CIO union should be arrested by the American proletariat and put on trial for treason. Svetlana says Gorbachev was extremely vain, dominated by his wife, not overly bright, and believed all the garbage that Alexander Yakovlev brainwashed him with. And Yakovlev was indeed, I think anyway, an asset of the CIA. I'm pretty much certain about that. Caustic Grip says he was naive in regards to Yakovlev, who was, according to KGB's internal report, linked to the CIA. Yeah, I think Yakovlev had been an asset of the CIA since probably the 50s. And he was corrupted by his wife and her desire for a lavish lifestyle. That's still true. Again, like, we need to always take a step back, though, and ask, how could such a manifestly inadequate person like Gorbachev, who, again, like, it would have been obvious his weaknesses, who was only really good at kissing ass, how did such a man become General Secretary? And then, once he was in there and it became obvious what a disaster he was going to be, why was he not removed? A comrade of mine recently made a point about some of the Russian, the KPRF leaders who constantly go on, correctly say that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was illegal, that Gorbachev was a fraud, and this comrade made an excellent point and said, well, why didn't they do anything about it then? Like, it was obvious from 88, really, why Gorbachev was going. And the reason why, of course, in my view, nothing was done about him was because there'd been 20 plus years of corrosion of the Soviet party by that stage. And the fighting element that would have been needed to remove a rotten general secretary had all gone. And so even those who wanted to preserve the USSR had no idea how to do it. So again, it's not just a question of Gorbachev and, you know, undercover CIA agents. It's a question of, well, how did those men get into those positions and why were they not stopped when it became obvious what they wanted to do? Like, you don't get Gorbachev and Yakovlev without Khrushchev and Kosygin. Edward asks if the USSR will ever be recreated in the future. Svetlana replies saying, not can, it will be. At least Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and maybe northern Kazakhstan will form the new USSR. Other republics may join later. I'd be interested to know what you mean by northern Kazakhstan, Svetlana. Is it the case that there is potential secessionary movements in Kazakhstan. I'm not fully aware of like the breakdown of that country, so I'm not sure why you would say northern. But certainly Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be a new union state comprised of those three. And it's going to, weirdly enough, the imperialists' cynicism and brutality towards the Ukrainians is going to cause the Russians to have to take the bulk of Ukraine and incorporate it into a new union state with Belarus. And the only way that that's going to be sustainable is if basically it continues to go towards a new form of socialism. It's not going to be sustainable under the rule of a deeply corroded bourgeois. At the very least, the Russian bourgeois will have to be kept in a headlock by a new form of communist party that I think will emerge in this new union state. So the imperialists have ended up becoming the midwives to potential rebirth of a new version of the USSR. Svetlana, thanks for the confirmation of what Volost is. It's a small administrative district from the Tsarist period, which was soon done away with by the communists. Interesting. Jenny says you can easily see why so many trots went full neocon. It's not that big a difference. It really isn't. That's why I always say Lyndon LaRouche was the truest representative of Trotskyism in many respects, because he openly said he was a supporter of elite rule, as were people like Irving Kristol. Trotskyites are elitists in their absolute core. Stalin was a true proletarian revolutionary. Batman asks, was Molotov corrupted? No, I mean, I've read his biography as told to Felix Chuev, and he admits his own errors in that. He admits his own errors when it comes to Khrushchev and the period after Stalin's death. So he died with, what was it, 500 rubles to his name, and like he owned like 2 suits. And the rubles were saved up to pay for his funeral. So that's not a man who was corrupted at all. I mean, for whatever mistakes he may have made, he never was out for personal gain and remained a true communist to the very end of his life. And I don't think he died. And him and Kaganovich lived until the mid-80s, I think. Alan Smith says, if Stalin was the Stalin of the Black Legend, there's no way he could have won World War II. That guy would have gotten overthrown in a week. Exactly the point, Alan. Very well made there. Robert Hand says, I was surprised to read Lizardo referring to the inevitable withering away of the state as a myth. Is it possible to have communism without belief that the state, however long it takes, will end? I mean, withering away of the state means basically that we go from a recognizable state organization that has commonalities with the bourgeois state in terms of the way it's organized, to something which looks entirely different. I would put it more in the same way that Engels and Marx insisted that the bourgeois family would end. People think that means, families end. No, it means it evolves into something new. A new form of family organization emerges in the socialist and communist period. So a new form of organization emerges in the communist period, which looks nothing like a state as they have been constituted since the end of primitive communism. So when you have a situation where the ruling class and the masses are one, meaning that the ruling class is not separate from the masses and exploiting them, the ruling class is the masses, then the need for repressive apparatus changes. You no longer have an army separate from the people, but you have an armed people. You no longer have a police force, but you have a well-regulated militia, perhaps, or a democratic militia. You don't have a state that stands above society. You have an administration of things that exists within society. And so I would put it that way. It's not that there's not an organization. It's that the organization resembles something that we we can't fully picture just yet, because it will only emerge with the disappearance of all class distinctions in the possible near or far future. But that's the way I would look at it. Greetings to Anthony, who joins us from Prague. Lee says, just seen advertised the book Soviet Democracy by Pat Sloan. Is this worth reading? Yes, it is. It's a very good book. He was a writer in the 1930s, I think. So yes, it's a report back on Soviet democracy of the 1930s. Very much worth reading. Verena joins us from Canada, not California. Well, I'm sorry to insult the honor of Canada. Alan, you're asking about the communist government of Afghanistan. Tell you what, note down that question, Alan, and email it to me, and I'll address it on a future episode. Svetlana says northern Kazakhstan because it is, or at least was until recently, populated mostly by Russians. Oh yes, I had heard that before. Did Zhukov tragically lay the foundation for the collapse of the USSR by backing up Khrushchev after Khrushchev was voted out 7-4 in the Politburo? Interesting point. You know what? I'm going to have to do more reading into that, Edward, because I'm not fully up to date. I haven't done enough reading to give you an educated answer on that point. So I'll read more into it and answer you on another day. All right, okay. So 324 of you watching. Thanks for everybody who's tuned in. This time, or shall we say 4 o'clock in the afternoon next week, we'll be doing Stalin's reply to the opposition at the 14th Congress. So please join me again for that one. We will be back tomorrow, same time, 4 p.m. with the next episode of A Marxist History of World War II. So please join us for that as well. Thanks to everybody who has joined us today. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Enjoy the rest of your day, and solidarity to all. We now return you to your musical accompaniment.